We're moving on to Geometry Lesson 6.1, Classifying Quadrilaterals. You'll need a paper and a pencil to take notes. Let's move on to the vocabulary we'll cover in this lesson. This is very important that you understand all of these terms. We will review when you get to class, but you should have these in your notebook, and as you read through your book and you come across one of these terms, please fill in the definition. So this is from your book. It's on page 248. They have a set of 4 figures. They're all the same. If you can see this, they're all a 4-sided figure. The figure is JKLM. There are different ideas that they point out in these figures, so this is what you need to pay attention to. First of all, what is a quadrilateral? Well, quadrilaterals are 2-dimensional figures with 4 straight sides. That's it. So quad, the root of the word quadrilateral means 4. So figures with 4 straight sides. Each one of these has certain properties that are important that you know. So consecutive sides, let's take a look. Consecutive sides of a quadrilateral are the sides that intersect at a vertex. So let's pick a vertex here and just pick vertex K. The 2 sides that intersect there, 2K, are JK and KL. So they're consecutive because they're right next to each other. Now the same figure can also have opposite sides. So we have opposite sides, JM and KL. They have no points in common. They share no points. They don't touch each other. Now we have consecutive angles, and consecutive angles are angles whose vertices are endpoints of the same side. So if you take side JK, JK includes angles J and K. So these are consecutive angles, or angles that are right next to each other. So the consecutive sides were right next to each other, the angles are next to each other. And then last you have opposite angles, and these are the angles that are across from each other. They're not next to each other. So opposite angles would be JL and KM. So let's begin with our first classification of a quadrilateral, and this is called the parallelogram. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral with 2 pairs of parallel opposite sides. So if you look at the pictures from this previous page, we don't know if these sides are parallel or not. In fact, we can tell that JK and LM appear to not be parallel. To be parallel, they would have to have the same distance between each other. So JM and KL would have to be equal lengths. And that's not true in this figure. But in this figure, they actually tell us that these sides are parallel by using these little arrows. So XY is parallel to WZ. XW is parallel to YZ. So in your notes, you should make a note of the word parallelogram, and you should make a picture that looks just like this. And note that these sides are parallel with the arrows. Now let's go to a familiar figure, the rectangle. The rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. So each one of these angles will be right angles. The last figure that we looked at, these were not right angles. They were not designated as right. And if you were to measure them, you would see that they are not 90 degrees. All 4 of these are 90 degrees. So once again, in your notes, word rectangle, and then make a picture that looks like this. Now we have the rhombus. The rhombus is a parallelogram, so that means that it has, and let me go back to the picture, just like this, it has two pairs of parallel opposite sides. But you can see that in this figure here, two of the sides are longer than the other sides. So in our rhombus, all the sides are the same length, or all the sides are congruent. Write that down and make a picture. We have the square. You know the square. The square is a rectangle. The square is a rectangle that has congruent sides, all the same length, and it also has congruent angles. We have a kite, a very interesting figure. The kite is a quadrilateral with two pairs of congruent consecutive sides. So you would have LM and LO are the same length, and MN and ON are the same length, but the opposite sides are not the same length. So you can see this has one hash mark, and then there are two hash marks, so they are not the same length. And last of our classification of quadrilaterals is the trapezoid. The trapezoid is a quadrilateral. That's a four-sided figure with exactly one pair of parallel opposite sides. So in this figure, KJ and HI are parallel, but HK and IJ are not. This figure also has a few different specifications that we call out. We designate KJ or JK and IH as bases, and KH and JI are called legs. If the legs are the same length or are congruent, the trapezoid is called an isosceles trapezoid. Now here's an example of how this all works. You have the general category of quadrilateral. This is your classification. It's just a polygon with four sides. And then we get more into detail. The detail will be important in this lesson. So you need to understand what each one of these figures has, and we'll be going over that in class. I will also give you a diagram like this for you to have for your notes. But as an example, let me just pick out the rhombus. All the properties, it has all the properties of a parallelogram. All sides are congruent, the diagonals are perpendicular, and its diagonals bisect the opposite angles. And through chapter 6 we'll be going through all of these. The rectangle is different from a rhombus because it doesn't have all sides congruent, and it also has right angles, and the rhombus does not. So these terms are what you're going to be dealing with, and you need to understand. So let's take a look at example 1. It says, to which defined subsets does each quad appear to belong? Label all categories that apply. So the subset would be the name of your figure. Okay, so we know they're quadrilaterals, they have four sides. But let's look at A. So A, and these actually should be marked. They don't do that in your book, I just realized that. But a parallelogram and a rhombus would be the two names that we can come up with these for these figures. And I put down here that it appears, this figure appears to have two pairs of parallel opposite sides and four congruent sides. They all look the same, and all the sides opposite appear to be parallel. In B, we have a trapezoid. It's just turned to its side from what the picture you saw before. And these would be the two bases, x, y, and w, z. And it has one pair of parallel opposite sides, and the non-parallel sides seem to be congruent, the same length, so this would be an isosceles trapezoid, which was the last designation from this picture that we talked about. So it's just taking this figure and turning it on its side. Example 2. You use these facts to solve a problem. So it says find the measure of each side of the kite. To be able to do this, you have to remember what property values the kite has. It has two lengths that will be congruent, that are meeting at the same vertex, and then it'll have two more lengths that are congruent that meet at the opposite vertex. KJ and MJ will not be the same length as KL and ML, but each will be, the shorter sides will be congruent to each other, the longer sides will be congruent to each other. So you could state this. So you can say that JK equals JM, JK equals JM, and now you have a set of values. So that would be x plus 5 equals 3x minus 1. And if you solve, you find out that x equals 3. Now you can take the other two sides, and they've used y as a variable, so you can state that KL equals ML, and KL is 3 times y plus 2, and ML is 5 times y plus 2, and if you solve, you'll have y equals 2. So you go back to do these problems, you remember or you look up what the definition of the kite was, and then you substitute the values into the problem and solve. It's always a good idea to check your answers, and in this case we took one side and checked. JK equals, replacing x as 3, 3 plus 5 equals 8, and JM replacing the x as 3 again. The answer is still 8, so that you know you've done it correctly. So your homework is to read page 6.1, just 2 pages. Read lesson 6.1, pages 248 and 249. Then watch this video, so you're supposed to have already read those pages. And you're going to be doing numbers 2 through 12 even. So let's go ahead and just take a look at what number 1 would look like. Now number 1 has a figure that looks just like this figure that was in your lesson. And this figure is the rhombus, and in fact number 1 uses the same endpoints, P, S, R, Q. And it says identify the following. So number 1, it says 2 sets of opposite sides in the quadrilateral. So our 2 sets of opposite sides would be PS and QR, and then PQ and SR. Let me say that again. The opposite sides would be PS and QR. That's the first set. And then PQ and SR. So when you're doing this, find a figure that looks the same and be sure to name as many sets as they ask you for. Now number 3 from your homework has a figure that's just like I showed you previously, and it is the trapezoid, and it is trapezoid HKJI, and your homework says find or identify the two sets of consecutive angles in the quadrilateral. So consecutive angles are the angles that are next to each other. So you only need to identify two sets, and so you could say sorry, the was because I wanted to double check what they're saying in the answer key. You'll only have two answers that are required from you, but there are actually four answers. So, as an example, if we're doing consecutive angles, we could say H and I, and then we could say I and J, or you could say J and K, or you could say angle K and angle H. So those are your options. Now for number 5, you would use the same figure, and it asks you the bases and the legs in the quadrilateral. So the bases would be KJ and HI, and the legs would be KH and JI. And that comes from your definition that we reviewed, and it should be in your notes for you to look up. Now number 6 says, list any classification that describes each quad, then underline the most specific classification if more than one description applies. And you're given 4 options, all the options that we've gone over. You have the kite, parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, square, or trapezoid. So the picture from number 6 looks like this. You look at the picture and say which one of the sub classifications or the subgroups of quadrilaterals is this one, and the parallelogram has 2 opposite parallel sides, so your answer to number 6 would be B. So once again, be sure to read those 2 pages. You'll have lots of notes in this chapter, and I will be checking notes. So make sure that you have your vocabulary on that list and you begin to fill it in, and that you have the pictures that we have described of the subsets here of quadrilaterals. I will bring you your lesson plan and your Venn diagram of the whole set structure of the quadrilaterals for you when we get to class, and complete your homework, and then we'll be ready to go on Tuesday as soon as we get there.